And now our program for today, we are really lucky to have with us Grace. I am just meeting him through Jared Morningstar, and Grace is a fascinating human being. He goes by both he, him pronouns and they pronouns. So Grace will address questions of perception, understanding, and action, drawing upon Alfred North Whitehead. He will, sorry, I'm going to hold this really close to my face. He will connect his analysis to an ethic of care and the potential of personal, social, and ecological transformation. Grace was originally a musician who was classically trained in cello and was also an experimental electronic composer and performer. So you get the point that they have always been involved in multiple media and multiple forms of understanding the world and communicating the world. The study of musicology led them to philosophy and the study of media arts and sciences. They say that in these adventures of ideas, and I quote, "It was a special and rare opportunity to develop technical, artist, and philosophical systems alongside each other." He discovered kindred spirits and organized the post-human network when he was in his doctoral program. And they did this with interdisciplinary graduate students around themes in the post-humanities. Grace's work has been transdisciplinary from the beginning, joining mathematics, computer science, computation, philosophy, and arts. Grace is a sound and media artist now in Chicago who works in installation, performance, and writing. He teaches philosophy for artists, computer music, programming of visual art, and other courses at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Illinois in Chicago. As an organizer, he also started the Center for Concrete and Abstract Machines. That is interesting. He seeks to bring philosophical insights to artists, architects, performers, and designers, and to work closely with practitioners in their many fields of expertise. Grace also enjoys dancing, running, and attending exhibition openings and concerts. Grace, you are such a fascinating person. We can't wait to hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary Elizabeth. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thanks also to Pat and Richard for hosting and to Jared for introducing all of us. I'm really excited to be with you all here today. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides with you. But again, very happy to be here with you all. As Mary Elizabeth alluded to, I've been interested in working in philosophy for about 10 or 15 years, seriously. The post-humanities being kind of this place of thinking about process and systems. And eventually I came around to Alfred North Whitehead and became acquainted with the Center for Process Studies, and have followed the work from the sidelines for several years now. I'm really excited to be here with you all. It seems like these process explorations are a really exciting place where people are developing community and having sustained conversation about many different topics through process. So I'm really honored and excited to contribute to that today. So I'm going to get right into it with a bit of an introduction. So the title of my talk is Symbols, Signals, and Sigils. And I do hope to provide some kind of perspective today on perception, understanding, and then this sort of foggy term of becoming, which I hope to suss out. This particular timing I think is really appropriate. I know that peace is a theme that process exploration has been focusing on. I've been reading a lot in the last 6 months on and thinking a lot about Alfred North Whitehead's concept of peace. That's going to come up later, but I'd like to kind of keep that in the background. I'll say something about that when we get there. Um, as Mary Elizabeth also mentioned, I've been in Chicago since 2020, and I've been hanging out with artists. My PhD it has artistic practice component, but being at a School of Art Institute and being in community with artists, I think has been extremely formative to me in many ways. The concerns, the matters of concern that motivate artists, I think, are different than obviously people who are working in philosophy or other fields. And so that's something that I'm also trying to be a little bit upfront about, is that part of my excitement for the last year or two is thinking about bringing philosophy into other kinds of circles, right? Particularly thinking with artists. Symbols, of course, becomes like a really interesting way to think about the relationship between process and art practice. Here I'll talk about symbols in a couple of permutations. I think artists have a complex relationship with the symbolic. They're creating symbols, they're recirculating them, but they're also regarding them with a certain kind of hesitancy. Think, for instance, about the way that myself included might also bristle at a certain kind of like second order reflection or theorization of artistic experience that tries to sort of stand in for the immediacy of experience. So this is again an attitude that I share, and I think that there's something there that I'd like to dig into. My background and my sort of approach comes from what Brian Masumi and Aaron Manning call activist philosophy. They themselves are close readers of Whitehead. And this idea is that what this means is that philosophy is an activation. It's a certain kind of activation of life, or of a form of life. So on that note, I'll share some philosophy today. And I'm also going to share some art practice that's been animated by that philosophy. And I want those things to kind of turn themselves over to kind of percolate some of these questions. Yeah, as I mentioned already, I'll be talking a little bit about symbols. Um, and yeah, maybe just one final note. I think I'm going to move between I'll move between close reading of some quotes and some philosophical ideas, and then move back into talking about art practice and things which are maybe a little more concrete. This is part of my ongoing process of developing some fluency and sharing and writing and generating modes of thought with others, without like dumbing down the ideas. I think this is a particularly challenging task, or at least I feel that way. There's some pedagogy here that I'm trying to rally. I'm trying to rally my skills as a teacher, but at the same time, I take it upon myself to become a student with and to the people I have the privilege of thinking with, which is you all today. If we can call what we are up to philosophy here today, I take seriously Whitehead's claim that philosophy can exclude nothing. Which means I'm very eager to hear about what is activated for you in this talk. What are your questions? What are your thoughts? What are your reflections on what I have to say here? So with that, also a little teaser for some of the art that comes later here in the background. We're going to talk about symbols, signals, and sigils. This first part here will be the most heavy technical lifting, so I encourage you to stick with me here, stay tuned. We'll talk a little bit about Whitehead's theory of symbolism, and the reason that I'm interested in that, and I think it gels so well with art, is that for him, perception, the way that we perceive the world, is really closely interlinked with symbols. And I'd like to kind of parse that out. I'll speak a little bit about a book project, like an artist book project that comes out of this kind of symbolic thinking at the end of that section. Um, Sorry, I just lost my place here. Great. Following, I'll talk about this idea of signals, which we can see are related in some way to symbols. I'm going to take, this will be a little more like, here are some quotes, and then I'm going to talk about some artwork in much more detail, this piece which you see behind you here. But this starts from a paper called The World as Medium by Andrew Murphy, and he presents a Whiteheadian media philosophy that I think is extremely compelling and gives us another, I think, just a different perspective on perception and signal that takes the technological really seriously. And then finally, we're going to talk about sigils, which kind of takes it into this other realm entirely. There's this idea of Whitehead's piece, which will be at the top of this. I'll talk a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari's idea of becoming, which I think is very exciting. And finally, we'll speak a little bit about magical practices, particularly sigilization, which not necessarily sigilization, but there's an interesting history of Whitehead being read through, or magic being read through Whitehead. I'm thinking of Isabel Stengers here, who I'll bring up a little later. But with that, I think let's get into it. We'll start with a quote from Gilles Deleuze. "Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object of a fundamental encounter. What is encountered may be Socrates, a temple, or a demon. It may be grasped in a range of affective tones, wonder, love, hatred, suffering. In whichever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. The object of encounter really gives rise to a sensibility with regard to a given sense. It is not a quality, but a sign." On April 8th, 2024, the momentary celestial alignment of the sun, the moon, the earth, and my body enfolded the perceptual field. I felt the force of the event pour into me, flow across my retinas and along my optical nerves, seeping into the occipital lobes of my brain and drip down my spine. My knees trembled, the air seemed to thin, contracting the space between my body and the crowd of people around me. I felt that the earth and sky had been compressed into a single plane, as vague, unknowable, and haunting cosmic forces surged out from a great black hole around which we were all circling. That day, I arrived in an Ohio city where I had spent most of my youth. To say that I was surprised by my experience would be an incredible understatement. I came with my family, glad to spend time with them, but really was only faintly interested in the eclipse as a kind of excuse to consider an event that exceeds and punctures the capitalistic mechanical time which governs our lived experience. Instead, I felt the lure of Pythagoras and Kepler's proposal that the sun, the moon, and the heavenly bodies made music. I felt perhaps something like what my mother might have felt in the dreams she would recall to me, in which she would soar through Van Gogh's Starry Night. I left that day with a feeling that my experience, my perception, had set into motion a vague but powerful insurgent movement, the onset of a profound transformation, the specificities of which I will refrain from elaborating. But in any case, what do we mean when we say perception? Let's turn to Alfred North Whitehead, because for Whitehead, all entities in the universe perceive. Mammals, plants, waterfalls, and eclipses, although each in a different mode contingent on their own formal organization. For Whitehead, perception objectifies the world for an entity. Perception abstracts the world. And so we have to say something here about abstraction. We're not alone in our head with our abstractions. Abstraction expresses nature's mode of interaction and is not merely mental. When it abstracts, thought is merely conforming to nature, or rather, it is exhibiting itself as an element in nature. And this comes from Whitehead's book on symbolism. In other words, perception is not just a matter of interest for psychology, but is the basis of the world. Abstractions are lived abstractions, to paraphrase Brian Masumi, where he draws on Gilles Deleuze, and this is quoted in Brian Masumi. The abstract is lived experience. I would almost say that once you have reached lived experience, oops, sorry, it keeps resetting. Once you reach Once you have reached lived experience, you reach the most fully living core of the abstract. You can live nothing but the abstract, and nobody has lived anything else but the abstract. So we can puzzle over this. What does it mean to live the abstract? I think this will continue to sort of unfold as we think about what Whitehead means by abstraction and perception. To return to Whitehead, these perceptual abstractions are mental because these abstractions are in a way private to us. The world appears to us, it appears as an object. It appears to me as an object. But they're not only for us, they're physical because they tether us to the concrete world. But because of this privacy, there lurks danger of an untethering from the world when abstraction lords over the world perceived. This is what Whitehead calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. What we do with our abstractions is the basis of an ethics. Following Isabel Stenger's, we must, quote, take care of our abstractions, which will be an underlying theme in this talk. I'm going to take some time to say a little bit more about perception for Whitehead, since his account of it is somewhat distinct from those of both common sense and most of Western philosophy. He moves away from the typical subject-object distinction that habitually cuts up the world in Western thought, towards a processual, which is to say experiential, durational, field-based account of perception. So for this part of the talk, we're going to get into these modes of perception Whitehead talked about. You may wish to recall a recent experience which you felt was impactful or maybe not impactful, an art event, a walk through a garden, a conversation with a friend, a visit to your hometown. There was an image that was shared before the talk started of a man walking through tear gas holding an American flag. Maybe it's the experience of seeing this image on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, for example. Keep this in your mind as we start to suss out what Whitehead means about perception. So the first thing in terms of nuts and bolts is that for Whitehead, perception is twofold. There's the mode of presentational immediacy and the mode of causal efficacy. So keep these in mind. We're going to move through these one by one. We're going to deal first with presentational immediacy. Presentational immediacy is our perception of concrete relations of space, geometry, color, odor between concrete, actual entities. This mode of perception is how actual things in our experience are introduced through, quote, colors, sounds, tastes, touch, and bodily feelings. This, in effect, is what we think of as, quote, sense perception in common and scientific terms, often thought to be the primary and most fundamental mode of perception, which, as an aside, Whitehead will say is the opposite, that this is something that only exists in more complex organisms. In Whitehead's words, presentational immediacy is our immediate perception of the contemporary external world, the world outside, appearing as an element constitutive of our own experience. In this appearance, the world discloses itself to be a community of actual things, which are actual in the same sense as we are. What we perceive in the mode of presentational immediacy, end quote, what we perceive in the mode of presentational immediacy is, quote, vivid, precise, and barren, end quote. This is barren because as mere experience, the data, the knowledge that we get from presentational immediacy provides no depth of the passage of time and the process of experience. This shallowness is reflected in how Whitehead scholar Erin Manning characterizes presentational immediacy. She says, presentational immediacy is the way in which the perceptual field entertains itself. So keep that in mind too. There's this kind of entertainment. We'll turn to talking about this other mode. What is this other mode? Causal efficacy. The second mode, causal efficacy, dominates physical and mental perceptual activity. It is a sense of the world's emergence out of itself, its causal consequentiality and its possible futurity, a sense of flux across the body and through the field of the world. By including this sense of the flux of experience as a mode of perception, as opposed to a way of thinking or a habit of thought, Whitehead casts his own lot apart from Western philosophy. This mode of perception is actually the most primordial for Whitehead and the most common mode of perception among the vast diversity of actual entities. Think of the examples that I shared earlier, a waterfall, an eclipse, a garden. Perception in the mode of causal efficacy is fundamentally processual and relational. And because of this resonant and vibrant character of causal efficacy, Brian Massumi and Aaron Manning referred to it as the entrainment. This is a physics term, the entrainment of the perceptual field. So now we have entertainment and entrainment. Brian and Aaron, so important to the whole entrainment, the rotational immediacy, and then causal efficacy, and then reverses, and they actually reverse them. There's an earthing gravity to causal efficacy, a sense of endurance, an appreciation of deep time. Whitehead calls it, quote, vague, haunting, unmanageable. He says it's the hand of the settled past in the formation of the present, and that it is, quote, heavy, primitive experience. The case of the eclipse is one in which this mode of perception phases into overdrive. And another quote from Whitehead, those periods in our lives when the perception of the pressure from a world of things with characters in their own right, characters mysteriously molding their own natures, become strongest, those periods are the product of a reversion to some primitive or, let's say, primordial state. This overdrive of causal efficacy and intensification of entrainment generates a stark contrast to the shallow entertainment of the perceptual field in presentational immediacy, sense perception. This contrast gives rise to feeling, impetus for poets and poetry. Whitehead characterizes contrasts like these by reminding us of the Latin inscription on many sundials, periunt et impedantur. I didn't practice that ahead of time. Essentially, the hours perish and are laid to account. Here, this is Whitehead, periunt refers to the world disclosed in immediate presentation, gay with 1,000 tints, passing and intrinsically meaningless. Imputanatur refers to a world disclosed in its own causal efficacy, where each event infects the ages to come, for good or for evil, with its own individuality. For Whitehead, these two modes of experience, presentational immediacy and causal efficacy, symbolism. Here we have the first mention of symbol. In the case of the eclipse, incredible gestuality, respectively, presentational immediacy and causal efficacy, but two, which were welded into a symbolic unity, eclipse, which preserved their poetic contrast. The sensation of the eclipse, my perception of it, charged the world eclipse with an intense affective gravity. This is not a mere, to be clear, not a mere updated definition of terms. The word eclipse does not refer to a specific eclipse, nor the astronomical category of eclipse events. It is bringing into community many different things: words, images, astrological events, and movements. This encounter enlarged and transformed a capacity to think and feel with an eclipse. It ushered in a new potential of eclipsing, a process. It enabled the possibility of taking an eclipse with you. Our perception is active. Experiences are activity. And activity for Whitehead is, quote, self-production, the production of the self, the production of an actual entity, concrescence. He writes that, quote, every actual thing is something by reason of its activity. So symbolization is a particular kind of activity. This is what Whitehead calls symbolic reference. Symbolic reference is activated by the mind with the body at the outset. The philosopher and artist Aaron Manning writes that, quote, symbolic reference does not refer to something. It abducts a something doing that perceives or prehends the world into act. It brings forth a world. It brings forth and produces a reality. The word eclipse in a conversation, an image of an eclipse, enter into experience with a novel possibility of reenacting, taking an eclipse with you, reenacting with a difference, the perceptual, sensational forces of an eclipse. Like perception, symbolism for Whitehead is not just a figure for arts and psychology, but is also the basis of the world. Symbolization, synthesis of stranded references to images, to experiences, are not limited to the domain and perception and symbols. The strands of symbolic reference usher in the possibility of occasions for conscious reflection, which allow their movements to sprawl, careen, tap into other parts of our experiences. The philosopher and student of Whitehead, Suzanne Langer, calls this ever-advancing process of turning over and around symbols and perception. She calls this symbolic transformation. So this is dynamic. It's not static. It's not pre-given. She writes, quote, do I have this in here? Oh yeah, wow. Forgot to move to the slide. Excuse me. She writes, as a matter of fact, it is not the essential act of thought that is symbolization, but an act essential to thought and prior to it. Symbolization is the essential act of mind, and mind takes in more than what it is commonly called thought. So this is something that precedes thought. This is something in the world that causes us to think, forces us to think, in Deleuze's terms. Symbolization contours the channels with which we connect to the world, parcels the abstractions which we live, and in turn contours the conditions for possible futures. We might say, oops, oh no, spoiler. We might say that the dynamic ensemble of these mutable strands of symbolic reference constitute our perspectives of the universe. This is Whitehead from Modes of Thought. Let us assume that each entity of whatever type essentially involves its connection with the universe of other things. This connection can be viewed as being what the universe is for that entity, either in the way of accomplishment or in the way of potentiality. It can be termed the perspective of the universe for that entity. And now I'm going to turn to this artist book that I made. So congratulations, we made it through Whitehead's perception and symbolism. I want to share something that sort of came out of this long duration of thinking about eclipse, thinking about the kind of deterministic movements of celestial bodies, which are entirely predictable, or at least in this present moment, are predictable. We can predict when an eclipse would happen, and share this artist book, which I had made, which also deals with the experience of eclipsing. This was something that I made. I made these images and printed them onto risograph, or with a risograph, which is a particular kind of printing process, into an artist book like this with black and gold ink. This is a small edition of 36. And you can see that I'm drawing on a certain kind of symbolic imagery that actually I would have probably avoided before this eclipse experience, actually. I'm playing with symmetry here. I'm playing with transformation. I'm playing with order. And here is the sort of mock-up of all the images here. There are, to do the math quickly, 32 panels in this book here. You can see that each one of these, you basically have these quadrants, which are sort of have this fourfold reflection. And I'm using my skills as a computational media artist to process these images in various ways, to play on certain kinds of rhythms like the solstice, the winter solstice, and movements of the sun in the sky. With that, I'm going to turn to the second part and say something about signals. And I'm going to give a quote, but then I'm going to get right back into the art here. So I mentioned that there is this paper from Andrew Murphy, which I've been chewing on for a couple of years now. And it comes from this quote from Process and Reality, which is that the world can be conceived as a medium for the transmission of influences. Andrew Murphy is a philosopher and a thinker, but also a musician, also somebody who makes music with his computer and with synthesizers and other things which use signals, communication technologies. And so he's interested in then if the world can be conceived of as a medium for the transmission of influences, then what is signal in that case? And I see this as a different perspective on symbolization. This is something I'm still chewing on. I think eventually this talk will be part of a larger piece, which hopefully will retain this threefold format. But here are some I think wonderful quotes from here. Signal is a structural modulation of the world's own self-feeling or perception via an ongoing communication between heterogeneous series. Signal is thus found everywhere, not just in the computer, but in the world, in perception, and at all scales, down to the level of the ongoing genesis of channels in the quote, dark precursors, that's a Deleuzian term, by which the world gathers the elements of its own micro perception. So there's something about signal for Murphy, which is imperceptible to us, in fact. There are communications which seem to precede a certain kind of becoming that we take notice of. He says, signal is a contrast in motion. All a sign is, he's making a distinction, all a sign is an instant gathering or tension within a signal. It is a perspective on a signal. Any sign is thus an actual occasion or gathering of actual occasions. So what I see him doing is like taking Whitehead's symbolism and like kind of trying to go one level down. Whitehead is mostly concerned with human and mammalian perception. But if we take Whitehead seriously as a sort of more than human thinker, which I'm inclined to do, it is also worth it, I think, to look at this more heterogeneous primordial level of thinking about, like, you know, how does a computer communicate, for example, or a garden. Okay, I'm going to play an art example here. I'm going to stop it there. So I'll go ahead and stop it there. So this is something from my own practice, which a work that I just completed in 2025. That's this year in May. And you can see it here before you in the daylight as a fixed image here. The projections, there's this projection element, there are these sculptural elements, there's obviously this sonic element. Just to give you a sense of scale, this is about 25 feet wide and 8 or 10 feet tall. I'm just going to talk about this piece here because it kind of came out of all this thinking. And show some images. You'll see that these sculptural elements here have this sort of reflective quality to them. which are being projected on. And so as you're in the space, the projection moves across these reflective sculptures and creates glints and glimmers. The name of the piece, Post Tenebras Lux, is its own sort of rich strand of references, which I've given some talks about before, but I'm not going to go into today. But suffice to say, obviously very eclipse coded, very solstice coded. Some more close up here. There's me at the opening. Hello, looking cute. And then folks interacting with this. So, here we see somebody touching this piece. It's a sound piece, but also each one of these plastic shells is its own speaker. And so people were also putting their bodies on this piece and feeling it move through their bodies. It was immersive in a way that, we don't typically think about immersiveness as being, you're in the Van Gogh room and you have 1,000 projectors or whatever. There's a kind of synced sound, feeling, haptic kind of thing going on here. There's also performance. This was activated by a performance. This is with a friend and collaborator, Odette Stout, and the media artist Ava Davidova, who's based in New York. And Ava has a piece where she brought this from New York to Chicago. They have a projector with these prompts that they are sort of projecting around the space. They're moving the projection around with their body and speaking them into a microphone. And then the model or the dancer will move in conjunction with them or in response to them. And this facilitates a collective drawing session. The title of the gallery show, this group show, was How to See in the Dark. So the only lights in the space were the projector, some lighting for Ava's piece, and then we handed out these headlights. And what was really incredible was that I should say too, the installation was a part of this. So as sort of the performance unfolded, I was plugging these into each other and activating and growing this kind of tension that you hear in that sound work. What was really miraculous, I think, was that we just got, this is like a portion of the drawings. We got 150 drawings. People were just like mad drawing them and fluttering them off the page there. So that's just a little bit about sort of how this took up space. I'm just going to say briefly, because I want to get to this last portion here, a little bit about how I made this. You can see that I'm using code here and process to generate the shapes. This is a mock-up that I made to generate the geometry of these sculptures, which then with my friend collaborator Claire Fleming, we fashioned into these molds out of cardboard. We laser cut these. And then those molds were used to form plastic. And I experimented with various kinds of materials to try and give these plastics different textures. And ultimately, I settled on having the kind of ribbed structure of the cardboard left or imprinted in the plastic, and used this iridescent film that I ended up bonding with the plastic when we vacuum formed it. As I mentioned earlier, each one of these shells is also a speaker, and this is important because here's some close-ups. Because in fact, the way that the sound is generated, it's generated in real time by the interactions between these different speakers. So I designed these circuit boards, which had a small pseudo computer on there that was running the sound code and sending it to its own little amplifier that went out to a speaker. But how it made decisions to change notes. You maybe noticed in the sound, the tones would sort of settle someplace, and then one of them would move, and then another one would follow, and then another one follows to a different tone and moves. They're all tuned into each other in a way through these cables and are looking for things that may be important, right? They're sort of tuned in a particular way. I can say more about that. And what I would like to do is eventually spin this out through Whitehead's modes of thought, especially matters of fact, importance, and expression. Maybe I'll just read this quote, and then I'll move on to the last section, and try and finish up by like one or so, just since we got started a little bit late. But this was actually the quote that kicked this whole project off for me, which I think is just absolutely one of the most gorgeous lines in this book. Thought is the outcome of its own concurrent activities, and having thus arrived on the scene, it modifies and adapts them. The notion of pure thought, an abstraction from all expression, is a figment from the learned world. A thought is a tremendous mode of excitement. Like a stone thrown into a pond, it disturbs the whole surface of our being. But this image is inadequate, for we should conceive the ripples as effective in the creation of the plunge of the stone into the water. The ripples release the thought, and the thought augments and distorts the ripples. In order to understand the essence of thought, we must study its relation to the ripples amid which it emerges. And so this is a process which I wanted to take seriously and wanted to implement in the technical design of this installation, but also in the sort of potential for experience as well. So I'm going to move to this final section here. Ooh, what's this? Oh, this is just an example of I'm going to move past this. This is an example of how that sort of matters of fact importance thing works. But I'm just going to get to the last part of this talk here in the interest of time. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of sigils, or to introduce the idea. I'm already thinking of it because, in fact, the first sort of project code name for this project that I just showed you was peace sigil, which is a nod to Whitehead's concept of peace. And so I was thinking quite a bit about, peace for Whitehead is this certain kind of horizon. It's an ideal for society. And like, what is it that the symbolic can do in terms of generating ways to approach this? And so he says, just to say, what is it that's meant by peace for Whitehead? And maybe this has come up in this series already. Peace is the feeling as to what would happen if right could triumph in a beautiful world with discord routed. Peace is the feeling. It is the passionate desire for the beautiful result. In this instance, such love is distracting, nerve-wracking. It involves deep feeling of an aim in the universe, winning such triumph as is possible to it. It is the sense of eros hovering between peace as the crown of youth and peace as the issue of tragedy. I think this is one of the most beautiful sections in all of Alfred North Whitehead. And anyway, we can say more about that maybe in the Q&A. And I've also just lost my place in my paper. Here it is. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to the idea of the sigil, and maybe get into, this is going to kind of go to a different place. We're going to start talking about symbols in the world, which I'm going to call sigils. And this may be more immediate than what Alfred North Whitehead means, right? When Alfred North Whitehead's talking about symbols, he's talking about something super molecular, something that we're not really aware of necessarily. It can be unconscious. When we talk about sigils, they can be unconscious in a different way. So typically we'll start with the logo, which is maybe the most symbolic sigil that we're aware of. Danish autonomous Marxist brand theorist Adam Arvidsson writes that, quote, brands build on the immaterial labor of consumers. Their ability to create an ethical surplus, a social bond, a shared experience, a common identity through productive communication, end quote. In other words, the word McDonald's does not only communicate the identity of a corporation, it lures a generation of excess feeling, associative, rhizomatic, affirming, even if the affirmative is of a negative feeling like disgust. This notion of a surplus upsets the tight interlock of symbol and meaning that Whitehead is also trying to write against. There's something Whiteheadian about thinking sigils. In other words, the power of the brand is that we don't know ahead of time what it could mean. Corporations, of course, do not care what they mean. They're interested in what branding can do. Arvidsson considers the origin of the word brand a red-hot piece of metal which painfully sears skin and flesh, transforming the body at the level of the nervous system. The relation of the word logo with logos suggests a little concrete machine, whose power is the proliferation of abstract machines, a logic of sensation rather than a logic of sense-making. In both cases, it is clear that these symbols are powerful operators at the pre-conscious or pre-subjective levels. So in other words, although we sort of see a logo and we recognize it as such, there's something that's going on at this sort of pre-conscious perceptual symbolization level, at the level of affect or feeling as well. The spilling out of surplus labor comes not from a cognitive, rational reception of the message. When I see McDonald's logo, I don't think McDonald's is an affordable place to eat. But of course, it's rhetorical power. Logos build worlds through their capacious generation of modes of thinking and feeling. And this relationship between logos and sigils has been written out by comic book artist Grant Morrison, who has described them as such. He writes, the McDonald's arches, the Nike swoosh, the Virgin autograph are all corporate viral sigils. Corporate sigils are super breeders. They attack unbranded imaginative space. They invade Red Square. I'm going to skip a little bit. They are powerful development in the history of sigil magic. The logo or brand, like any symbol, is a condensation, a compressed summing up of the world of desire which the corporation seeks to represent. So I'm going to agree with a little tweak here. I think that what the any and all means necessary, including the colonization of the imagination. But I would say that corporate designers are really not able to anticipate how this colonization proceeds. Instead, a sigil catalyzes an emergent sensation that leads to something unprestatable. I'm transformed by my experience of the corporate logo. And this is different than thinking about a symbol as having a static representation. So we're going to talk a bit just about, here's McDonald's. Oops. Oh yeah, back to Matt Lee. We're going to talk about this, this person, Spare. Sorry, I keep losing my place here. Through an author named Matt Lee, who's reading Deleuze and Guattari against Spare. Spare is an artist, an author, and somebody, a chaos magician. So in contrast to the symbol, the sigil means nothing at all. How can we say this when we are aware of the deep intentionality of the design of the logo? So Spare is going to kind of get us into this with this concept of sigilization. And I'm just aware of time here. I'm at 1. I'm going to take 5 more minutes just to kind of find, I'll get as far as I can and then reach my conclusion. So Matt Lee talks about sigils. It's important to distinguish very clearly Spare's form of sigilization from any traditional notion of symbolism. Spare uses symbols in a way that is far closer to an artistic use of stroke or color. The paint stroke does not stand for, contain, transmit, or somehow make us able to see the real picture behind the strokes and colors, but is in fact the picture itself. This process is manifestation. It is an act itself. This act of symbolization disturbs the very concept of symbols with a split in Spare's work between symbols and sigils. And just to sort of get to this last quote from Spare, we are not the object by the perception, but by becoming it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about becoming here. But first, I want us to consider also something which I would consider maybe one of the most effectual and consequential sigils of our era. Make America Great Again. Leftists and liberals will often wring their hands. What does MAGA mean anyway? Of course, it means nothing. The red MAGA hat is a sigil. It's a pure, live, very exciting aesthetic experience. It is the red, flushed, rosy skin of engorged organs. It's branded red like a red hot brand, seeking pleasure in pain. How does this sigil work? How does this hat work? What does it do? 1,000 lines of flight explode out of a red cap, generating dark crystal consistency across a new plane. The continuous defeat of the left, which is something that I've been thinking about with many others for at least a decade, lies in the right's incredible power to cohere desires on a different plane of consistency we have not yet seen before. There's something working here which is novel. In other words, anti-vax yoga moms, 3%ers, and gamer boys all create a resonant assemblage that literally vibes together. So what I'm trying to say here is that the right is very good at magical practices. If a sigil signifies nothing, what does it do or how does it work? Now we can speak a little bit about this idea of becoming. First, becoming, which is what some people, even us who of course don't agree with MAGA, would enter into with this hat. Becoming is not a metaphor. It's not symbolic. It's metaphysical, active, affectively and psychically and virtually real. So they say, above all, becoming, again, as opposed to being something which is static, does not occur at the level of the imagination, even when the imagination reaches the highest cosmic or dynamic level. Becomings animal or any kinds of becomings are neither dreams nor fantasies. Becomings are perfectly real, real. And now I want to show another example of something of a sigil. This part of the talk and this part of my thought is indebted to conversations with friend and collaborator Odette Stout, and they showed me this. They're a Chicago-based drag artist and visual artist. They shared this paper with me that they teach from somebody named Sonia Shannon. It's from 1991, and it reflects on 1980s corporate Chrome logos. And the example that they use, I think quite appropriately, is this text, it's real. And these logos in 1980s corporate culture were meant to herald a new digital futurity in graphic design and in 3D animation, where artists could find new freedoms and expression thanks to advances in science and technology. Again, considering that becomings are perfectly real in the text of this logo, we see this kind of sigilistic character here. I'm also indebted to Odette Stout, who pointed out this connection. They use this in their teaching to teach young people about, obviously the way that we inherit from digital cultures of years past. There's a connection between the 1980s Chrome logos and contemporary cyber sigil aesthetics, which we find used in graphic design, fashion, tattooing, motion graphics, animation, and so on. The name of this cyber sigil, this aesthetic references both the chromic design style of the 1980s, obviously cybernetics, as well as this magical practice of sigilization. And we can say a little bit more about sigils and becoming. Maybe what I shall do, just in the interest of time, is skip to my conclusion. So we can talk about symbols working at the level of perception. They make the perception's abstractions mobile and motive for us. Perception's abstractions, the way that it objectifies the world, is a potentialization of reality. What we perceive as infallible, or it is infallible, how we symbolize is automatic, biologically, socially, psychologically, and politically. These are encoded. But symbolization itself is not immutable. The ethics of taking care of our abstractions encourages us to tend to them like a garden. And this is what I'm trying to do here with like thinking through these sort of sigils as a sort of seed for becoming. We see how they work in brand theory. We see how they work on the right. Is there something for us here to think about in terms of artistic practice, in terms of symbolic meaning practice, collectivization, and so on? A garden itself is a dynamic ecology of symbolizations between the earth, the rainfall, the sun, the moon, and the creatures of the earth. Its experiences of the world has much to teach us. How are our abstractions in the service of what Whitehead calls peace? How can we bend towards the open autonomization of becoming? How can we nurture the paradoxical feeling that the world is both an entertainment for us and that we are entirely awash in the entrainment of the cosmos? What are the symbolic practices which are up to this task in our contemporary moment? And with that, I've reached the end of my talk. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to discussing with you. You can reach me here. You can find me online. You can check out CCAM. But I'll stop sharing so that I can see you all again. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to chatting.
Wow. Thank you so much, Grace. This was fascinating. I'm